apologize in advance. I live in Bordeaux and I'm a wine teacher at the Bordeaux Wine School. So the Bordeaux Wine School is run by the winemakers from Bordeaux, so some of the people that you have here on the various booths today. And in the next 30 minutes we're going to have a very brief overview of Bordeaux, but concentrating on the notion of vintage, which is something very particular to Bordeaux. Every year, of course, we have a different vintage. So I'd just like to start with a little bit of an introduction to the region. It's a big region. It's not working. Yes, it is. There we go. So looking at the map or the screen, you can see it's a very large region, Bordeaux. There's almost 113,000 hectares. It's very, very large. And there are about 7,000 wineries, between 7,000 and 7,500 wineries. A lot of different wineries. You've got quite a few of them here, but there aren't 7,000. But as it is a big area, it has a lot of appellations, what we call appellations. This is a very French concept, and the idea is the quality of the wine, the characteristics of the wine, and the style of the wine are linked to where it comes from. The real word is appellation origine contrôlée. Origine means origin, where it comes from. And where it comes from is what gives the characteristic to the wine. So what we're going to have a quick look at with two different wines is some of the characteristics of the different wines that we have in the Bordeaux region. So just looking at the map, you can see this large area is divided quite neatly into three areas by three rivers. We have the river here, this is the Garonne, it comes from the south. This river comes all the way from the Pyrenees on the Spanish border. You then have the Dordogne River that comes in from the east, from the Massif Central, and they join together. Here is the city of Bordeaux. They join together just north of the city of Bordeaux to make the Garonne estuary. Now the Gironde estuary, sorry. This is a big estuary, it's a big body of water. It's about 12 kilometers wide. Why is this important? Well, this is important because it affects the climate. And when we talk about vintage in Bordeaux, it is all about the climate. Because we have a temperate climate, but this climate can vary enormously from one year to the next. So the style of the wine, even from the same vineyard, can change from one year to the next, depending on the weather that we have. So what is it that influences the weather? Well, we're on the 45th parallel, which means we're a temperate climate. We're kind of halfway between the equator and the North Pole. But the fact that we're very close to the Atlantic Ocean and that we have a Gulf Stream that runs up the Atlantic Ocean means it's very humid. Not quite as humid as it is in Hong Kong today, but we do have a very humid weather in Bordeaux. We have cold winters, we have warm summers, but the humidity remains. This is a challenge for Bordeaux because vines don't like wet weather. Vines don't like to sit with their roots in water. If we want to make a great wine, we have to ensure that the vine is a little bit stressed for water. If it thinks it's going to have water stress, it will concentrate on producing grapes, because the grapes carry the seeds, rather than just producing leaves. So we need to induce water stress, and the way that we do this is by very carefully choosing our soils that are available. As we have a large area, we have lots of different soils. So when we look at the map, we can see we can divide it into two areas. This area here, which we call the left bank, because it's the left-hand side of the water, and the rest of the area which we can call the right bank. And the soils are very different in these two areas. When we're here on the left bank, we have a very low area. It's close to the water. It's almost at sea level. It doesn't go higher than 40 meters above sea level. And the soil is made of gravel. Why? Because the rivers over millions of years have brought pebbles down from the mountains where they've come from, and they've left these pebbles in series of gravel outcrops that lie on this very low-lying area. This gravel is extremely well drained. Water runs through gravel really, really quickly, and the gravel has a particularity that it's very white in color. As it's very light, it reflects the sunlight. This means it's hot, and it means that it's dry. And these are two conditions that allow us to get grapes to ripen, particularly Cabernet Sauvignon. In Bordeaux, we blend. So one characteristic of Bordeaux is vintage change. Another characteristic is that we have blended wines. What does that mean? It means that we use several different grape varieties. You rarely see in Bordeaux a wine that just has Cabernet, just has Merlot. You will usually see a blend. And the blends that we are allowed to make are controlled by legislation. We can only use 6 red grapes when we look at our blend. And we also have legislation for white grapes. Today we're going to talk mainly about the red grapes, the red vines, because red wine makes up 88% of Bordeaux production. It's mainly red wine. We do make white wine. We make lovely white wine, and if you walk around you'll be able to try some. We make dry white wine and sweet white wine. We also make rosé, and we also make sparkling white wine and sparkling rosé wines. Today we're going to talk about the red wines. So for the red wines, the grape varieties that we use are mainly Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Merlot. You will see some Malbec, you will see some Cabernet and some Pinot Noir. Those are the 6 grape varieties. If you come to Bordeaux and plant other grape varieties, you can make wine, but you will not be allowed to call it Bordeaux. So where we plant the grapes is very closely controlled. It has to be within this area, and what grapes we plant are very closely controlled. So here on the left bank, as I said, it's mainly gravel, hot, dry soil. Cabernet Sauvignon will thrive on a hot, dry soil. Why? Because Cabernet Sauvignon is a small grape with a very thick skin. And because it has a thick skin, it takes a long time to ripen. So especially in our climate, which is relatively temperate, we need to plant it on those warm soils to ensure that it will ripen. However, as soon as we cross the river, whether it's here the Garonne or whether it's the Gironde estuary, we get into a completely different environment. It's much, much higher. It's about 100 to 150 meters above sea level, and the soil is made of limestone. Limestone is really interesting for wine. Limestone was formed when all this region was underneath the ocean. It's all the crushed shells that have been packed together through the weight of the water. But limstone can soak up about 6 times its weight in water. And as it does that, it takes the water away from the surface and allows the vines to have that dry environment that they need to get the grapes to ripen. But on top of this limestone, there is clay. And as limestone and clay retain water, they're much cooler soils. They don't have that heat that the gravel has, so it doesn't reflect the light in the same way. So what happens is here, Cabernet Sauvignon really struggles to ripen. So the majority of planting here is Merlot. Merlot is a different grape variety. It's got a bigger berry with thinner skin. It flowers earlier, it buds earlier, it ripens earlier. And the difference is in the wine, the Cabernet Sauvignon with the thicker skin produces a more powerful, more structured wine, wines that are made mainly for aging, whereas the Merlot is a rounder, smoother wine. It has more fruit and less tannins. So when we look at the difference in the blends of Bordeaux, when you see where your wine comes from, you'll understand that it has different blends. Why does this affect the vintage? Well, obviously, in hotter vintages, Cabernet Sauvignon is going to thrive everywhere in Bordeaux. In cooler vintages, the Merlot is going to do better because it ripens more easily than the Cabernet Sauvignon. So this notion of vintage is very important, because we know that the wine is going to be slightly different, but we also know the blend will change. The winemaker will change his blend every year, just a little bit, as a function of how the grapes have ripened in that particular vintage. So the blend will change. So that's just an idea of what Bordeaux looks like. And you can see here in the facts and figures how big it is. Bordeaux is a big area. It's the largest fine wine producing area in France. It represents 1.5% of the world's vineyard, just a small area in France. It's a very important global producer of wine. As I said, over 7,000 wineries. We have 60 different appellations. Remember I said an appellation is a place, it's all about the place. When you look at this map, all these names around the edge are the different appellations that make Bordeaux. So within Bordeaux, we feel that different areas have different personalities because of the soils and the microclimate. I've oversimplified, we're talking about the left and the right bank, but you can see within these areas, when we look at the detail, there's going to be different personalities, different sun exposure, slightly different soils, slightly different microclimates, that mean that all these areas merit a different name, and we'll be tasting wines from 2 of these different appellations. So you can start to understand the complexity. It's all basically the same blend, but this blend percentages will change as a function of the climate, as a function of the soil, to make up this wonderful diversity and complexity. that we have in Bordeaux. So I've talked about the geography, the difference in height, the difference in climate. I've talked about the maritime climate. We have a huge advantage also. This green area is not vineyard. The soils aren't any good for vines. It's sandy soil because we're close to the ocean. But we have a big forest that is planted there, and that's also a huge advantage for us because it protects the vines from the storms that come in off the water. Now we like to have some wind because just like today, some wind gets rid of the humidity. Humidity because not only do the vines not like sitting in water, but humidity can also make the grapes go moldy. We don't want moldy grapes unless we're making sweet wine, but we don't want moldy grapes for our red wines. So to have a little bit of breeze that comes in off the ocean is good, but it protects us from the storms that come in from the ocean. So what we have is this notion of a magic formula. We have the region, the geography, we have the climate, and they come together to vary throughout the region to make these specific microclimates. And then as a function of this microclimate, a function of the terroir, the French love the word terroir, their place, the wine grower will decide which grape varieties he's going to grow to make the best possible wine that he can on his soils. So this notion of climate and geography affects the quality of the wine. It's the key to understanding how Bordeaux works. So the wines that we're going to try today, we're going to try a Bordeaux Superieur. So about 50% of Bordeaux production is called Bordeaux or Bordeaux Superieur. These are the wines that can be made anywhere within this region. Wherever you are within the region, in any of these appellations, you have the right to make a wine called Bordeaux, as long as you obey the rules, as long as you don't produce too much, because the rules include not just where you plant and what you plant, how you grow, how much you grow, the winemaking techniques we're allowed to use, and when we may age and bottle the wine. So we will taste a Bordeaux. Bordeaux can be made within the whole region. And then we're going to taste a Côte wine. So Côte means slope or hillside. Remember how important I said the drainage was? When you have a hillside, you get more drainage, you get better sun exposure, and you get more breeze, which helps to keep the grapes dry. And around this big limestone plateau, you can see the rivers have cut into it and worn away the limestone plateau, and they've created slopes down the side. We call these areas côte. A côte means a slope in French, and so we get this better drainage. So we'll taste the Bordeaux soup and we'll taste a Côte wine. So this area here is Côte, here is Côte, and here is Côte, on the edge of those limestone plateaus. So that's just a word, as I said, I've already mentioned this, talking about the appellation, the legal definitions. If it has an appellation on the bottle, you know that it comes from one of the 60 Bordeaux appellations. You know it's a guarantee of quality. Because as well as where and what we plant, the quality is controlled specifically by the yield. You're not allowed to produce too much, less is better, right? So we produce a minimum yield, maximum yield, which means that we're controlling the quality rather than just producing a huge amount of wine. That's why the yields are very, very low. We say in Bordeaux, the average for a red wine, you get 1 bottle of wine per vine plant. And so it's very low yields, which allow us to maintain the quality of the wine. I talked about the diversity. We're just tasting the reds today, but I encourage you to walk around the booths that we have. You will see rosé, you will see clairé, which is like a dark rosé. You will see dry white, you will see sweet white, and you will also, I think, see some sparkling wine from Bordeaux. It's a very tiny, tiny percent of our production. It's less than 0.5%, but it's well worth looking out for. But as I said, the vast majority of Bordeaux is the red wine. 88% of our production is red wine, which is what we will taste now. So just a reminder of the grape varieties that we use. A quick word about the white wines. The white wines are also a blend, just like the red wines are. They're made up of 3 main grape varieties that are Semillon, Sauvignon, and Muscadelle. Sauvignon Blanc is a grape variety I'm sure you're very familiar with. It's grown all over the world, makes very aromatic, dry, very fresh wines. Semillon is a little bit more complex, it's a little bit heavier, rounder, smoother. And just like with the red wines, we believe that by blending, we're bringing more complexity to the party. You've seen with red wines, we blend because we have different soil structures, but also by blending and by using different grape varieties. Each grape variety has a different personality in its aromas, in its mouthfeel, and so it brings more to the party, adds to the complexity and the elegance of the wines. With the red wines, as I said, Cabernet Sauvignon brings power and structure. Merlot brings roundness, fruit aromas, and smoothness, and when we bring them together with a little bit of Cabernet Franc, which is kind of between the two, we add complexity and elegance to our wines. And this is the whole notion of blending. So the first wine, if we could serve the first wine. I've lost my assistants, but thank you. The first wine, as I said, we're going to serve is a Bordeaux. So we've got two different vintages, because the object of the exercise with this tasting really was to help you understand the different vintages, the difference between two vintages. So what was 2011? 2011 was a relatively cool vintage, and you remember I said in a relatively cool vintage the Merlot does better because Merlot ripens earlier. It started off quite cool, it warmed up towards the end of the season, but so 2011 is a vintage where Merlot did particularly well. And because it was a cooler vintage, we have a lot of freshness. Freshness in a wine corresponds to a notion of elegance. If it gets too hot and too ripe, a wine can become heavy. Because what happens as the berry ripens, the sugar increases, but the acidity decreases. And what we try and do in Bordeaux, and we're very lucky because of our climate, what happens when we have warm summer days, we usually have cool nights. And when we have cool nights, it stops the berries getting too ripe. And so it keeps freshness and acidity. So it keeps this notion of elegance within the wine, which is what we're looking for. And 2011 was the perfect example of that. We had warmer days towards the end of the season, but we had lovely cool nights. And those cool nights allowed us to keep this notion of freshness and elegance. And so this wine, as I said, is a Bordeaux Superieur. Now if you see Bordeaux and Bordeaux Superieur, you kind of imagine that Bordeaux Superieur is better, right? Because it's got Superior on the label. The difference is really, the Bordeaux Superieur will have a lower yield. We won't produce as many berries from the vine for Bordeaux Superieur as we do for Bordeaux. So it does make a difference to the quality and the concentration of the wine. So normally a Bordeaux Superieur will be a little bit more concentrated. It will also have aged for longer before we bottle it, so it will spend a little more time aging. And this again adds complexity. It's usually aged in oak barrels, so this adds a support and a complexity on the aromas and the structures of the wine. So this allows us to have this complexity in this wine. So 2011, Bordeaux Superieur, doesn't say so on the slide, but this is a wine that is dominated by Merlot, as I said earlier. We're looking at about 70% Merlot for this wine and about 30% Cabernet, a mixture of Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc. Could I have a little bit more? Thank you. So when we taste a wine, the first thing we do is we look at it, and you're sitting on nice white seats, and you've got nice white tables, so you can look over the white surface and look down through the glass of wine. And we look down through the glass of wine because it gives us a notion of the concentration of the wine. How dense is the color? How easy is it to see through? And so when you look down through this wine, you can see it's relatively light. It's got a nice color, but it's not hugely dense. You can see through it. If you put your hand underneath it, you can see the shape of your hand through the wine, right? So it's not a hugely dense and concentrated wine, which is what we would expect from a Bordeaux and a Bordeaux Superieur that is dominated by Merlot. And Merlot, as I said, is a lighter grade, thinner skins, fruit-driven, and producing very nice, fruity, juicy wines. The other thing that we can see is the notion of color. A red wine changes color as it ages once it's bottled. A very young wine will have a blue-red, almost violet color. And as it ages, that color will change from that purpley color into more of a garnet red color, ruby red color, and eventually you'll start to see a sort of browny, orangey tinge. This doesn't necessarily mean it's off, it's just that what happens to the wine as it ages. It oxidizes very gently in the bottle. And when we tip the wine to about 45 degrees and we look around the edge, it's easier to see if there's a change of color. This wine is still very young. 2011 is relatively young. So this wine would have been bottled at the beginning of 2013. So it's only had 2 and a bit years in the bottle. So it's still relatively young. But you can perhaps see that it's not that purpley. and it's got a little bit of sort of a garnet red around the edge of the wine. So just before tasting it, we can already get an idea of what we can expect. So now the second stage is we're going to smell the wine. We talk about first nose, second nose. So the first nose, just put your nose in the glass, have a think about what it smells like. For me, this smells very fruity. Wine's made from grapes, right? Grapes are a fruit, so it should smell fruity. But it does. It smells very fruity. It smells of red fruit. It smells a little bit of cherries, but it's also got a bit of a floral note to it. It smells a little bit like violets or even roses. So it's got this very sweet nose, very sweet, very easy, very fresh nose. Now, when you swirl it around the glass a little bit, what should happen is you release more aromas. It should smell stronger or more complex when you swirl the wine around in the glass. You also should get a little bit more freshness, almost a little bit of minty freshness of it. That's the alcohol that evaporates. It's a lot easier for those of you who have glasses like this. This is the good size glass, because when you swirl it around, you don't splash it out, right? It stays in the glass. So what are we doing? Well, we're obviously going to look at the flavors, what it tastes like, so any different aromas and flavors we can pick up, but it's also how the wine feels in the palate. Does it feel fresh? Does it feel tannic? Does it feel acidity? Normally the tip of your tongue, the first impression you will get will be fruity, because the tip of your tongue is very sensitive to sweetness. And then as you move the wine around in your mouth, you'll start to feel acidity down the side of the tongue, and you might feel some tannin structure. Looking at this wine, you can imagine it's not going to be that strong and powerful because it looks quite light in the glass. So we'll see if that corresponds to what we have in the palate. So I think you'd agree that it's very sweet on the attack, it's very fruity, but that sweetness is not due to the sugar. All the sugar has been transformed into alcohol of the wine. The sweetness is the flavors that come out of the skin. That's the first impression, but after that, you get an impression of freshness and acidity in the wine. And then at the end, you've got a little bit of texture. Not exactly bitterness, but you can feel, it makes your mouth water, how the acidity makes your mouth water. But you can feel a little bit of light texture in the wine, but not much. It doesn't have a lot of tannins. It doesn't make your mouth feel dry at all. And this is very characteristic of the Merlot-driven wines of Bordeaux. They're light, they're fruity, they're easy to drink, and in 2011, this particular vintage was a very fresh vintage. So it reinforces this note of very fresh fruit. It's a little bit like fresh cherries in the mouth, and it's really got that impression. So that is, as I say, 2011 Merlot-driven wine, Bordeaux Superieur, a fairly typical example of what we would expect. And just as a word about the different wines that we're tasting, I think some of you have picked up the booklet, the Everyday Bordeaux booklet. All the wines that we're presenting here are wines from an everyday selection. One of the things that we're very keen to impress upon you is that the wines of Bordeaux do not have to be really, really expensive. There's a range of wines that have been chosen that show the diversity of wines, and that they start under $100 and they go up to about $400 or $500. But you can get a range of wines within a very affordable price point that are easy drinking wines like this. So, moving on, blending. I've talked about the blend and how the blend changes. What's interesting is within a single vineyard, the wine grower is not going to plant his Merlot and his Cabernet all mixed up together. He's going to have different fields, and each field will have a different grape variety in it. And each field is going to have a slightly different soil structure. So he's going to treat each individual field almost like a separate winery. He's going to grow the grapes separately. He'll probably pick them on a different date. He might treat them differently. And when he brings them into his wine cellar, he's going to put each plot of land in a different vat to ferment it. And he might pick them on different days. So when you walk into a wine cellar, you'll see 20, 30, 40 different vats, and each vat will have a different wine in it. So when he comes to blending, he has to blend all these grapes together, but he might not use them all. He might decide that some of those vats aren't good enough to go into his wine in a specific year. So every vintage, the recipe or the blend that he makes is going to vary slightly, depending on the climate in that particular year. So he will blend from his different vats that might be different varieties, but they might be older Merlot or younger Merlot, and they might be Merlot grown higher or Merlot grown lower. He will then decide to age them, and then there will be a final blending at the end, because aging in barrels affects the flavour and the tastes of the wine. And so each barrel will be very, very slightly different. So again, he has to blend at the end to ensure that every single bottle that comes out of his winery is exactly the same. As far as tasting the wines is concerned, the way we serve wine affects its flavours. I talked about the glass just now. If you taste the same wine out of a plastic glass and out of a glass, it's going to taste a little bit different. Why? Because when you've got a glass with a shape like this, it's easier to move the wine around, and the aromas stay inside the glass. So you're going to get much more concentrated aromas when you taste out of a wine glass like this. So what we serve it in is also important. Do we decant wines? Well, we can decant our wines. Why? Why do we decant wines? Well, one reason is it looks really nice on the dining room table in a decanter, but that's not the real reason. There are two main reasons for decanting wines. The first one is if you serve a very young wine that's very powerful and very structured, sometimes it feels a little harsh on the mouth. If you decant it an hour before serving it, it allows what we call the air to attach. We call the wine breathes. And what that means is it accelerates the aging process. It would happen naturally in the bottle. And this breathing allows the wine to develop, to become softer, for the tannins to become softer, and the aromas to develop. You might have noticed in the glass, the first nose was less aromatic, less powerful than the second nose when we'd swirled the wine around a little bit. Well, by decanting the wine, we do the same thing. And also, it's important not to serve the wines neither too cold or too hot. Why? Well, if they're really, really cold, especially red wines, you don't smell the aromas. The aromas are trapped because they're too cold. And on the other hand, if it's too hot, the wine, it becomes a little bit flabby and not very elegant and not very nice. So the serving temperatures that we recommend for red wines are about 16 to 19 degrees, no more. So room temperature. It's a little bit warm here today, and so we're keeping our red wines on ice, which you can do. But to be honest, what's important is that you find how you like to serve your wine. And if you want to serve your red wine chilled, you can do whatever you like, as long as you enjoy the wine. So, I talked about decanting. So the second wine, if you'd be so kind, that we're going to try is very slightly different. So the main difference with this wine is that it is a different vintage. So you can see this is 2010. You kind of think, well, it's only 1 year. What difference will a year make? Well, I hope you'll see that it makes a big difference. Because 2010 was a very, very hot vintage. It was a very warm vintage, and it was a perfect conditions all the way through the years for making excellent red wines. It started off with perfect flowering conditions. That's really important because we need great flowers if we're going to get great fruit. And then the whole season was very dry, very hot, but then again cool evenings. So what we got in 2010, although it's a year older, was a much more powerful expression of what Bordeaux is. Now this wine is a Côte de Bourg. Remember we talked about the different soils? Côte de Bourg is this little blue area up here, higher up in on the hills, above the estuary, above the Gironde estuary. It's a clay over limestone soil, but it's on those slopes. So what we have is a combination of an excellent vintage and a slightly more powerful terroir. Limestone, remember, that sucks the water away, gives the hydric stress, but also the slopes that give extra drainage, extra sun exposure, and extra breeze. So all these things come together to make much more concentrated grapes. And that is going to give us more concentrated wine. Again, it's dominated by Merlot, a very high percentage of Merlot, just like the other wine. But the fact that it's a more powerful soil, we can say, and a more powerful vintage will give us a more powerful and more structured wine. So again, I think when we look at the wine, that's the wrong glass. I can't remember which one they've served me. I'll get it. I think it's that one. The colour is quite different in this wine. You see, it's more, when you look down through the wine, you can see it's denser. It's not quite so easy to see through the wine. So it's also got a stronger colour. I would say slightly more blue colour, a more purpley colour than the other one. It's a much darker colour. So we can already imagine that we're going to have a wine that has more concentration. And the nose is quite different too, right? So just put the wine to your nose. Can you feel that it smells a little bit different? It smells more powerful. It's got perhaps more of a concentrated, more dried fruit aroma, darker fruit. It smells a little, it's also got more of a little spicy note to it. Spicy, perhaps a little bit of vanilla spice to it, oaky, smoky. This is also down to the concentration of this particular vintage, but also because it spent a little bit more time in oak. It's had a longer barrel aging. As it's a more powerful wine, it can spend a little bit more time in oak without being overpowered by the oak. The oak should be a complement to the wine, it shouldn't dominate it, which I think is the case here. So you've still got the fruit, but you've got the spiciness that the oak brings as well. So when we taste it, again, quite different on the palate. Can you feel? It feels different, right? It tastes different on the tongue. The first attack is more powerful, more structured, very ripe fruit again this time. Not quite so flowery and elegant and fresh, much more powerful and structured fruit. And you can feel the tannins. It's got more bite to it. It's more bite, it's stronger. But what is also interesting with this wine is that once you swallow it, the flavors stay quite a long time. You can still taste it in the mouth afterwards once you've swallowed it. So this is very typical of the difference between these two vintages, only a year apart, but quite different climate conditions, interpreted by a slightly different soil that reinforces the strength between these two vintages. So this is what we're trying to do, to show you that Bordeaux can be complicated, but it's fun. But as well as the areas that give the personality to the wine, the vintage effect is quite strongly marked in Bordeaux. But it's very easy to find out about these things. It's not difficult to get the information. As I said, 95% of Bordeaux is very accessible price point and style-wise. But if you go to Bordeaux.com, you can learn more about the individual vintages, you can learn more about the individual appellations, and you can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook to see the news, to see what's happening in Hong Kong, as well as elsewhere in the vineyards of Bordeaux. And I encourage you to go and meet some of the winemakers that have come from Bordeaux this weekend to be with you, and taste the wines, and then take your exploration of Bordeaux another step forward. Thank you very much.